Welcome to Void of Rules, the home of spine-chilling stories that break all the rules. If you love a good scare, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment and subscribe. Your support helps us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Now let's jump into today's story. The student loans weren't going to pay themselves. That's what I kept telling myself as I pulled into the crumbling parking lot of Ravencrest Memorial Hospital, my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds pushing through the fissures. The building loomed against the darkening sky, a massive structure of weathered brick and dirty windows that seemed to absorb what little remaining sunlight struggled through the heavy cloud cover. I'm Mark Winters, and this was supposed to be my fresh start. 3 months of desperate job hunting after graduating nursing school had led me here, to the only hospital within 50 miles desperate enough to hire a newcomer for their night shift. The pay was surprisingly good, which should have been my first warning sign. The main entrance's automatic doors wheezed open as I approached, releasing a burst of stale air that carried the sharp scent of antiseptic and something else. Something older and mustier that I couldn't quite place. The fluorescent lights in the lobby flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the worn linoleum floor. A large clock hung above the reception desk, its steady ticking echoing through the empty space. "You must be Mark." The voice made me jump. An elderly woman emerged from behind the reception desk, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her name tag read, "Miss Bennett, night supervisor." Her pale blue eyes seemed to look through me, rather than at me, and her smile didn't quite reach them. "We've been expecting you." She moved with an unsettling grace as she came around the desk, her footsteps making no sound despite her practical nursing shoes. In her hands, she clutched a small leather-bound book, its edges worn smooth with age. "Before we begin your orientation, there are some special procedures we need to discuss." Miss Bennett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Ravencrest isn't like other hospitals, Mr. Winters. We have our own way of doing things here, especially during the night shift." I nodded, trying to maintain my professional demeanour despite the growing unease in my stomach. "Of course. I've worked night shifts during my clinicals." "No," she cut me off sharply, then seemed to catch herself. Her smile returned, but there was something strained about it. "No, you haven't worked nights like these." She pressed the book into my hands. The leather was cold to the touch, and I could feel strange indentations beneath my fingers, like words had been carved into it and worn away over time. "These are your guidelines for the night shift," Miss Bennett continued. "Our special procedures. Rules, you might say. They must be followed exactly as written." She gripped my wrist suddenly, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Exactly, Mr. Winters. No exceptions, no deviations. The consequences of ignoring these rules are severe." I opened my mouth to ask what she meant by severe, but she was already walking away, gesturing for me to follow. Her shoes still made no sound on the floor. "The West Wing is closed for renovations," she explained as we walked. "The East Wing houses our long-term care patients, but they're special cases. You won't need to check on them. Your duties will be confined to the Central Wing, floors 3 through 5. As we walked, I noticed how empty the hospital seemed. Where were the other staff members? The visitors? Even for night shift, the silence felt wrong. "Most of our patients are transferred to other facilities after sunset," Miss Bennett said, as if reading my thoughts. "We maintain only a skeleton crew here at night. It's better that way." We stopped at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor. The monitors cast a pale blue glow across the empty desk. A single phone sat in the centre, its black surface reflecting the flickering lights above. "Read the manual carefully before your shift begins," Miss Bennett instructed. "Memorize every rule. Your life may depend on it." Before I could respond, she added, "Oh, a Mark? If you hear anyone calling for help, make sure it's really a patient before you respond." With that cryptic warning, she turned and walked away, disappearing around a corner. I could have sworn the temperature dropped several degrees as soon as she left. I sank into the chair at the nurse's station, the leather creaking beneath me, and opened the manual. The first page contained only 5 rules, written in elegant, flowing script that seemed to shift slightly as I read them. My hands trembled as I read the first rule: never look at the clock after midnight. Something in the distance, deep within the hospital's winding corridors, made a sound like a muffled scream. I told myself it was just the heating system. The second rule stared back at me from the page: always answer the phone, no matter what. Below it, someone had scratched a note in shaky handwriting: "It rings for a reason." I flipped through the rest of the manual, finding detailed maps of the permitted areas and lists of standard procedures that seemed normal enough: checking vital signs, administering medications, monitoring equipment. But between these mundane instructions were odd warnings. If room 347 appears on your rounds, skip it. There is no room 347. And the vending machine in the 4th floor break room only accepts pennies from before 1983. Do not use any other coins. My orientation with Miss Bennett had been brief. Too brief, really. She'd shown me the medication room, pointed out the supply closets, and explained the basic protocols. But she'd spent more time talking about what not to do than what my actual duties would be. The night started quietly enough. I began my rounds, checking on the few patients listed on my roster. Most were sleeping, their monitors beeping steadily in the darkness. Mrs. Henderson, in 302, needed her pain medication. Mr. Cooper, in 315, required a bandage change. Normal tasks that helped settle my nerves. But as the night wore on, things began to feel off. The corridors seemed to grow longer with each pass. The shadows in the corners deepened, even when I was sure I was standing directly under a light. And the sounds, subtle at first but growing more distinct. The squeak of wheels from empty rooms. The soft tap of footsteps when no one was there. I tried to focus on my paperwork, but my eyes kept drifting to the clock hanging above the nurse's station. 11:47 p.m. The first rule weighed heavily on my mind. What could possibly happen from looking at a clock after midnight? At 11:55, I made a final round of my assigned rooms. Everything seemed normal, though the air had grown colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite knowing the heating system was working. I checked it myself earlier. 11:58. I organised my files, trying to keep my hands busy. 11:59. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The clock's second hand seemed to slow as it approached midnight, as if moving through syrup. I forced myself to look down at my papers, remembering the first rule. The urge to look up was almost overwhelming. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. The sound echoed through the empty corridor, followed by the distinct sound of someone shuffling across the floor. Footsteps, slow and uneven, moving closer to the nurse's station. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Do you need assistance?" No response, but the footsteps continued. Closer now. I should check, I thought. It could be a patient who needs help, but something kept me frozen in my chair, staring down at my desk as the footsteps grew nearer. They stopped just on the other side of the nurse's station. The air grew so cold my fingers began to ache. A smell like old pennies and decay wafted over me. I could hear breathing, wet, laboured breathing, coming from directly across the desk. "Don't look up," my mind screamed. "Don't look at the clock." "Nurse?" The voice was wrong, like several voices speaking at once, some high, some deep, all slightly out of sync. "Could you tell me what time it is?" I gripped the edge of my desk, knuckles white, eyes fixed on my paperwork. "I'm sorry," I managed to say. My watch is broken." A long, drawn-out sound, maybe a sigh, maybe a laugh, and then silence. When I finally gathered the courage to look up, after what felt like hours, I was alone again. The clock read 12:07 a.m. I'd survived my first test, but as I sat there, heart pounding, the phone began to ring. The phone's ring pierced the silence, its shrill tone seeming to reverberate through my bones. Rule 2 echoed in my mind: always answer the phone, no matter what. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. Before my fingers could touch it, the ringing stopped. Then immediately started again. I picked up on the first ring. "Third floor nurses station, this is Mark." Static filled the line, along with what sounded like distant crying. Then a voice, barely audible. "Please, they took my baby. You have to help me find my baby." "Ma'am, which room are you in?" "I can come." "Room 322, the voice whispered. "Hurry. They're getting closer." The line went dead. My stomach dropped. Room 322 was on my rotation sheet, but when I checked earlier, it had been empty. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried down the hall, the beam bouncing off the walls as I walked. The crying grew louder as I approached the room, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The door to 322 was closed, though I distinctly remembered leaving it open during my rounds. The handle was ice cold when I touched it. As I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood freeze. Wet footprints leading to the bed. Not from the door, but from the wall itself. The room was empty, but the bed sheets were disturbed, as if someone had just been lying there. A baby's rattle lay on the pillow, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. When I picked it up, I noticed a date engraved on its base: June 15th, 1962. The sound of a baby crying echoed from the bathroom. I approached slowly, the rattle still clutched in my hand. The bathroom door creaked open at my touch. Inside, the mirror was covered in condensation despite the cold. Words were forming in the fog, as if written by an invisible finger. "They took her from me. Will you help me find her?" The rattle in my hand suddenly felt warm. When I looked down, tiny fingerprints were appearing in the dust. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart racing. As I turned to leave the room, I collided with someone. A young woman in a hospital gown, her hair wet and tangled. Her arms were outstretched, reaching for the rattle. "My baby," she whispered, her voice the same as the one on the phone. Water dripped from her hair, but instead of falling to the floor, it ran upward, defying gravity. "They said I was unfit. They took her away. Help me find her." I clutched the doorframe, fighting the urge to run. The manual had been clear. These encounters had protocols. I want to help," I managed to say, "but I need you to tell me who took your baby." The woman's face contorted, her features blurring like smoke. "The doctors, the nurses, all of them. They said I was sick, that I would hurt her." Her form flickered like a bad television signal. "Room 347. They took all the babies to room 347. My blood ran cold as I remembered the note from the manual. There is no room 347. "But," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you already know that, don't you, Mark? You were there." The rattle in my hand began to vibrate violently. The woman lunged forward, her body passing through me like ice water. The lights exploded above us, plunging the room into darkness. When I managed to turn my flashlight back on, both the woman and the rattle were gone. I stumbled back to the nurse's station, my uniform soaked with cold sweat. As I sank into my chair, trying to catch my breath, I noticed something on my desk that hadn't been there before. A patient file from 1962. The name on the tab read, Margaret Whitmore, room 322. With shaking hands, I opened the file. A black and white photo showed the same woman I'd just encountered, holding a baby. The admission notes detailed postpartum psychosis. The final entry simply read, "Patient deceased, apparent suicide. Infant transferred to room 347 for observation." The phone began to ring again. The ringing seemed different this time, more urgent, more insistent. I stared at the phone, remembering Margaret Whitmore's haunting words. But Rule 2 was clear. Always answer the phone. I lifted the receiver. "Third floor nurses. Don't open the door." Each word was punctuated by static, the voice deep and authoritative. "The storage room on 4th floor. They're trying to get out." The line cut off with a burst of static that made my ears ring. I checked the manual again, finding Rule 3. Do not open any door you aren't instructed to. A loud bang echoed from above, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I glanced at my round sheet. I was supposed to check the 4th floor supply levels at some point during my shift. The elevator was at the end of the hall, its buttons casting a pale yellow glow in the darkness. As I approached, the doors opened on their own with a soft ding. No one was inside. Every instinct told me to take the stairs instead, but I found myself stepping into the elevator anyway. The ride to the 4th floor seemed to take longer than it should have. When the doors finally opened, I immediately noticed the temperature difference. It was at least 20 degrees colder than the floor below. The storage room was at the end of the hall. Even from a distance, I could see something was wrong with the door. Dark liquid was seeping out from underneath, spreading across the floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't liquid at all. It was shadows moving against the laws of light and physics. They writhed and twisted, forming shapes that my mind couldn't quite process. The door itself was vibrating slightly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. The handle began to turn on its own, slowly, degree by degree. I reached for it without thinking, some foolish part of me believing I needed to check, to make sure everything was secure. Just before my fingers touched the metal, a hand grabbed my wrist. The grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. I turned, expecting to see Margaret or another apparition, but there was no one there. Yet the pressure remained, holding me back from the door. The shadows at my feet began to retreat, sliding back under the door like a receding tide. The handle stopped turning. A voice, barely a whisper, came from the other side. "Thank you." I pulled my hand back, finally free from the invisible grip. As I backed away, I noticed something carved into the door that hadn't been there before. A list of names, dozens of them, all former Nightshift workers. Looking closer, I realized with horror that I recognized some of them from recent missing person reports in the local news. At the bottom of the list was a fresh carving, the wood still splintered and raw. Margaret Whitmore, room 347. I practically ran back to the elevator, but when the doors opened, Miss Bennett was inside. She looked different, older somehow, her skin almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light. "You're learning," she said with that same strained smile, "but the night isn't over yet, and Rule 4 is the most important of all." Her form flickered like a bad television signal, and suddenly I was alone in the elevator again. As the doors closed, I remembered Rule 4. Never leave the patient rooms unattended after 3 a.m. I checked my watch. 2:57 a.m. The elevator seemed to crawl back down to the 3rd floor. My heart was pounding as I checked my watch again. 2:59 a.m. I had to get back to the patient rooms. The doors opened to darkness. All the lights in the hallway had gone out, except for the dim glow of emergency exit signs casting everything in a blood-red hue. The air felt thick, almost solid, making each step forward a struggle. I used my flashlight to navigate back to my station, the beam seeming to be swallowed by the unnatural darkness. The patient monitoring screens were still on, their steady beeping the only normal sound in the oppressive silence. 3 a.m. I started my rounds immediately, remembering Miss Bennet's warning about Rule 4. Room 302. Mrs. Henderson was sleeping peacefully, her vitals stable. Room 315. Mr. Cooper was reading a magazine, which struck me as odd given the time. "Everything okay, Mr. Cooper?" I asked from the doorway. He looked up, and for a moment his face seemed to shift, becoming younger, then older, then settling back to normal. "Just fine, nurse, just fine." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "But you might want to hurry. The others are getting restless." A scream echoed from down the hall, from room 322, Margaret Whitmore's room. But that was impossible. I'd just been there, and it was empty. I rushed to the room, pushing open the door. The bed was occupied now, but not by Margaret. An elderly man lay there, his hospital gown stained with something dark. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were completely black. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, my voice shaking. "Neither are you," he replied in Margaret's voice, "but here we all are." The monitors in every room began to screech in unison. Running back into the hall, I saw that all the doors were open now, and every bed was occupied. But the patients, they were wrong. Their forms seemed to flicker and change, like radio stations caught between frequencies. I checked my roster with trembling hands. There should only be 5 patients on this floor. So why were all 20 rooms full? Moving from room to room, I saw faces I recognized from the old files I'd found. Patients who had died here decades ago. Some looked at me with pleading eyes, others with anger, and some had no faces at all. In the last room, a figure sat in the corner, facing the wall. It was humming a lullaby I recognized from the rattle in room 322. As I approached, it slowly began to stand, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Miss Bennet," I called out, remembering her warning about making sure it was really a patient before responding. The figure stopped humming, but didn't turn around. "She can't help you now," it said in multiple voices speaking at once. "No one can." "You looked at the clock, answered the phone, avoided the door. But you forgot the most important rule." Rule 5 flashed in my mind. If you see something you shouldn't, don't scream. The figure began to turn around, its head rotating independently of its body. The figure's head made a complete rotation, but its body remained still. Its face. I bit down hard on my tongue to keep from screaming. Where features should have been, there was only a swirling darkness, like looking into a deep well at midnight. But somehow I knew it was smiling. "You've made it further than most," it said, its voice now sounding like Miss Bennet's, but distorted, as if played backward. "Most don't survive past the first rule. But then again, most don't have your history here." My history? I'd never worked at Ravencrest before. Yet as the figure spoke, memories began to surface. Memories that couldn't be mine. A baby crying in room 347. Margaret Whitmore's desperate pleas. The storage room door opening to reveal. "Stop," I commanded, surprised by the strength in my voice. "Those aren't my memories." The thing that wasn't Miss Bennet laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Aren't they? Why do you think you were really hired, Mark? Did you think it was just coincidence that we chose you?" The walls around us began to pulse like a heartbeat. In each room, the patients, real and impossible, started to rise from their beds. Their movements were synchronized, mechanical, as they all turned to face me. "You were here in 1962, the figure continued, "and in 1975 and 1989, different names, different faces, but always you, always returning, always forgetting, always failing." The temperature dropped so low that frost began forming on the walls. The other patients started moving toward the doorways, their forms flickering between different ages, different people, different deaths. "This hospital remembers," the thing said. "The walls remember, the doors remember, and now it's time for you to remember too." It reached out with a hand that kept changing, young to old, flesh to bone, solid to shadow. In its palm was the baby rattle from room 322, but now it was covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. "Take it," the figure commanded. "See what you really are." I stood my ground, remembering something else from the manual. A small note scribbled in the margin that I barely noticed before. "The hospital lies. Trust only what you brought with you." What had I brought? My nursing credentials, my watch, my ID badge. I pulled it out, holding it up like a shield. "I'm Mark Winters, graduated from Cedar Grove Nursing School 3 months ago. These aren't my memories. This isn't my past." The thing hissed, recoiling slightly. "You can't deny what's in your blood. What's in these walls? Why do you think you were drawn here?" But something was happening. The ID badge in my hand began to glow with a soft light that seemed to push back the darkness. The patients stopped their advance, their forms becoming less solid. "No!" the figure snarled, its voice losing its power. "You have to remember. You have to complete the cycle." The badge's light grew stronger, and with it came clarity. I wasn't some reincarnated worker. I was Mark Winters, and I was being manipulated. The hospital, or whatever lived inside it, was trying to make me doubt my own reality. "I know what you are," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "You feed off doubt, off fear. You make people question themselves until they're too weak to resist." The thing that wasn't Miss Bennett shrieked, the sound shattering every window in the hall. The other patients began to melt away like smoke, leaving only the dark figure. "You think knowing makes you powerful," it spat. "Others knew, others fought. Look where they are now." The walls rippled, and suddenly I was seeing flashes of past nights, other workers who had reached this point. Some tried to run, some tried to fight, some gave in to madness. All of them failed, but they had all been alone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The figure laughed. "No signal in here, clever boy. No calling for help." "I don't need a signal," I said, turning on the phone's camera. "I just need proof." The thing lunged at me, its form expanding into something massive and impossible. But as my phone's screen lit up, showing its true form, the creature recoiled. In the camera's display, I could see what it really was. Not a monster, not a demon, but a tear in reality. A hungry void trying to disguise itself. "Others tried recording before," it hissed, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. "Not like this," I said, remembering my badge, my phone, my modern equipment. "This hospital is old. Your tricks are old, but I bet you haven't adapted to new technology. Have you?" The figure started to unravel at the edges, its darkness fragmenting like static. The walls shook violently, and a deep groan echoed through the building. "You can't change what this place is," it snarled. "What it needs." "No," I agreed, "but I can expose it." I started recording, narrating everything I'd seen. The rules, the phone calls, Margaret Whitmore, the storage room, everything. Each truth I spoke seemed to weaken the hospital's hold, like lancing an infected wound. The thing launched itself at me in desperation, but passed through me like smoke. My badge's light and phone screen had created a barrier it couldn't cross. Suddenly, Miss Bennett appeared. The real Miss Bennett, looking frail and human. "Run," she whispered, "while it's weak. Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted toward the stairs, not trusting the elevator. Behind me, the thing was screaming, its voice a mixture of every patient who had ever died in these halls. The stairwell door burst open under my shoulder, the metal groaning in protest. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my phone still recording everything. The screaming followed me, growing more distorted with each floor I descended. Behind me, doors began slamming open and shut. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing 1 second, sweltering the next. Footsteps echoed from both above and below, their rhythm impossible. Too many feet, moving too quickly. "You can't expose us," the voice boomed from everywhere at once. "The hospital will never let you leave with that recording." I reached the second floor landing when the lights went out completely. In the darkness, I could hear something crawling along the walls, its movements fast and erratic. My phone's light showed nothing, but I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. "Every night, shift worker who tried to expose us joined our family," the voice taunted. "Their bodies were never found because there were no bodies to find. Just empty rooms and desperate families asking questions no one could answer." I burst through the door to the first floor, my lungs burning. The main lobby was ahead, but something was wrong. The entrance doors seemed to be moving further away with each step I took, the floor stretching impossibly. The registration desk was occupied now, by every version of Miss Bennet I'd seen throughout the night, all staring at me with those pale eyes. Some were young, some old, some barely more than shadows. "We tried to make this easy for you, Mark," they spoke in unison. "We gave you the rules. We tried to help you join us properly. Now it will have to be the hard way." The main doors began to frost over, ice creeping across the glass. The clock above the desk spun wildly, its hands whirling backward. I could feel the hospital trying to pull me back, trying to make me part of its twisted history. But I had one advantage they hadn't counted on. While they'd been talking, I'd been sending the video. New phones, automatic cloud backup. Even with no signal, it was saving and uploading every buffer it could find. "You're right," I said, addressing all the Bennets, all the patients, all the things hiding in the dark. "I can't expose you, but I already have." I held up my phone, showing the upload confirmation. The effect was immediate. The Bennets screamed in rage, their forms dissolving. The stretching hallway snapped back to normal. The frost retreated from the doors. I ran. Behind me, the hospital was coming apart. Not physically, but the veil it had built around itself was cracking. Through the windows, I could see lights coming on in empty rooms, shadows fleeing from them like cockroaches. The doors slammed open as I hit them, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I fumbled with my keys, I looked back one last time. The hospital stood silent now, looking almost normal in the pre-dawn light. Almost. But in every window, faces were pressed against the glass. Patients, staff, victims from decades of night shifts. Their expressions were a mixture of fury and desperation. Above the entrance, Margaret Whitmore stood holding her baby, both of them finally at peace. She nodded once before fading away. I started my car with shaking hands and peeled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, Ravencrest Memorial seemed to shimmer like a mirage, its windows now dark and empty. But I knew better. They were watching me leave. That was 3 weeks ago. The video I recorded went viral, but not in the way you'd expect. Every time someone tries to play it, they see something different. Some people see an empty hospital. Others see shadows moving against the laws of physics. A few claim they can hear Margaret's lullaby playing faintly in the background. The hospital is still operating, though they've closed the night shift temporarily for renovations. Local news ran a story about the history of disappearances connected to Ravencrest, but nothing concrete was ever proven. The building still stands, a dark monument to whatever lives within its walls. Miss Bennet, the real one, was found in her apartment, alive but changed. She can't remember anything about her time at the hospital, and her hair has gone completely white. Sometimes she hums that same lullaby Margaret used to sing. I've received job offers from other hospitals, but I can't bring myself to work another night shift. The darkness feels different now, heavier somehow, and phones. I can't answer a ringing phone without my heart racing. Last night, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in that same elegant script from the manual. Inside was a single page. Dear Mr. Winters, congratulations on surviving your first night at Ravencrest Memorial. You've proven yourself more resilient than most. But you should know, the rules weren't meant to protect you from the hospital. They were meant to protect you from what you could become. The position of night supervisor remains open. Miss Bennett's retirement has left a vacancy that only someone with your experience could fill. The hospital remembers you, Mark, and it's patient. We'll leave the light on for you. P.S. Room 347 misses you. I burned the letter, but the words had already burned themselves into my memory. Sometimes at night I swear I can hear a phone ringing in the distance, and I find myself reaching for it before I catch myself. They say Ravencrest Memorial is still hiring for the night shift. The pay is excellent. But if you apply, do yourself a favour. Don't look at the clock after midnight. Don't open any doors you're not supposed to. And whatever you do, don't answer the phone. Because somewhere in that hospital, in a room that doesn't exist, there's a baby crying. And sooner or later, someone will have to answer. I just pray it won't be me.